Chapter 3. Corlanth stared at his horse's black-tipped ears. The hillfolk passed through the gate of the residency, and Corlanth lifted his gaze to rake angrily across the dusty station street, the little dun-colored houses and shops, the small straggly trees. At a slight shift in his rider's weight, the red horse turned off the road. The sharp clatter of hoofs on the packed dirt road changed to the duller sound of struck sand. He could hear his men turning off the road behind him. He shook his head in a futile attempt to clear a little space for thought amid the anger, and leaned back in the saddle, and the horse's pace slowed. There was no sense in charging across the desert in midday. It was hard on the horses. The 6 riders closed up behind him. The 2 came forward to ride at his side, stole quick glances at him as they came near, and looked away again as quickly. Outlanders. Involuntarily his hands, resting slightly on his thighs, curled into fists. He should have known better than even to try to talk to them. His father had warned them years ago, but that was before the northerners had come so near. Corlanth blinked. The heat of his own anger was hard to contain when there wasn't some use he could put to it. Anger was splendidly useful on the battlefield, but he was not facing any regiments just now that could be tangled in their own feet and knocked over in companies. Much as he would like, for example, to set fire to that big stupid house, an absurd building in the desert, it must be the sort of thing they lived in their own country, and watched it crash down around the ears of the big soft creature who called himself commissioner. But spite was for children, and he had been king for 13 years. He bit down on his anger and held it. He remembered when he was young, and before the full flowering of his Kilar, of the terrible strength known ironically as the gift. His father had told him it would be often like this. We aren't really much good except as battle machines, and even there our usefulness is limited. You'll curse it often enough, far more than you'll be glad of it, but there you are, he sighed, and looked wearily at his son. They say that back in the great days it was different, that men were made big gifts, big enough to hold it, and had wit enough to understand it. It was the Lady Erin, the story goes, that first knew her gift and broke it to her will, but that was long ago, and we're smaller now. Corlanth said hesitantly. They also say the gift was once good for other things, healing and calming and taming. His father nodded sadly. Yes, perhaps it once was, but no more. Luth knows, if he will ever tell you, for he has the old Kilar, and who his parents are, even he has forgotten. But Luth is himself, and you and I are of duller blood. And it was the duller blood that was brought to us what we are, and what we remain, and what remains to us. Avoid the Outlanders if you can. They can't or won't understand us. They don't recognize horses from oxen, and will try to put a yoke on you when they have hung on the rest of our land. But their strength is in the strength of numbers and stubbornness and persistence. Do not underestimate it. You could see his father standing in one of the inner courtyards of the city in the mountains, staring at one of the fountains, water running shining over the colored stone of the hills, talking half to himself. When the picture faded, blotting out in another swift sweep of anger, he found himself looking at the girl again. The girl he had seen standing in front of the Outlander house. What had she to do with anything? He frowned, and his horse's ears and black mane reappeared before him. He looked up. It was still a long ride to their camp. He had not somehow wished to sleep too near the Outlanders. It was not that he suspected deliberate treachery, but that the air hung over an Outlander station set bad dreams to the hill folk. His anger kicked him again like a spurred heel. He flinched. It had a life of its own, the gift, damn it. What indecipherable object did it desire of him this time? He knew by now that the idiosyncrasy of kings and others whose blood carried much Kilar were viewed with much more alarm by the victims themselves than by their friends and subjects. Not that the alarm did any good. If one was king, and one could not explain away one's more impenetrable actions by saying that one just couldn't help it. Woven into his anger there was a pattern, or occasionally he understood it. He waited, gritting his teeth, and he saw the girl again. This time, as long as she was there, he looked at her. When he had first seen her at the foot of the steps just a few minutes ago, he had been surprised into looking at her. He knew what his glance could do when he was angry, and tried to be careful about whom it rested on, and for how long. But this girl, unfortunately for her, had somehow caught his attention, and he had looked longer than he had meant. She was as tall as most men, tall even by Outlander standards. Her hair was yellow, the color of sun on sand, and almost as bright. His people, the hill folk, were usually smaller than the Outlanders and dark of skin and hair. But it wasn't her size or her coloring that held him beyond the first startled flick of notice, nor was it her beauty. There was too much strength in that face and the long bones of her body for beauty. Something about the quietness of her, perhaps, or her self-contained straightness. Something about the way her eyes met his, with more thought behind them than the usual half-hypnotized, half-fearful look he was to expect if he held anybody's gaze too long. Even when his Kilar was quiet, something, he thought suddenly, like the controlled straightness he himself had learned, knowing well that what could happen if he relaxed. But that was nonsense. She was an Outlander. While there were still wild sports among his own people, where a few drops of royal blood from many generations would would suddenly burst into full Kilar in the veins of some quiet family child, there had never been an Outlander with the gift to consider. The train of thought took him far enough from the center of anger that he had begun to relax a little. His hands uncurled, and the black mane swept across against his fingers. He looked ahead. He knew, although he could not see it, that his camp lay just beyond the next bit of what looked like flat, bare, and partial desert, and that it was in fact a rise in the land, enough of a buffer from sand and stone to allow a small well of sweet water with little grass and low scrub to live behind a protecting shoulder. As he looked out across the desert, almost calm again, or at least finding the beginnings of calm, the Kilar suddenly produced a picture of Sir Charles, foolishly white-faced, anxiously saying, "My dear Sir, Your Majesty," and explaining why he could not help him. The picture was thrust before his eyes, and he took the breath in sharply between his teeth, having caught his attention, and the single-minded Kilar snatched Sir Charles away and presented him with the girl again. "What about her?" he shouted suddenly, but there was no answer. It was rare that the gift ever made it easy for him by explaining what he wanted. Sometimes he would never find out, and was left to muddle through like any other mortal, with an added disadvantage of inscrutable messages banging inside his skull. His patience gave way. He leaned forward in the saddle, and the big stallion leaped into a gallop. The 6 riders, who knew their king's mood and hadn't been very happy at the reception of the Outlander stands themselves, let him go. He swerved away from the line that would take him directly to the camp. The man on the gold dun, who had been riding on the king's right, soothed his mount with one hand. "Nay, we do not follow him this time." The man at his left glanced across at him and nodded briefly. "May the just and glorious be with you." The youngest of the riders snorted with laughter, although it was not a pleasant laughter. "May the just and glorious be with all of us, damn the Outlanders." The man on the dun frowned and said, "Inath, watch your tongue." "I'm watching it, my friend," said Inath. "You may be glad you cannot hear what I am thinking." The king had disappeared in the heat glaze rising from the sand. By the time the little group topped the rise and saw the pale tents of their camp before them, and resigned themselves to telling those who awaited them that had occurred during the meeting with the Outlanders. Harry blinked and recognized the boy at her elbow. "Thank you," she said absently, and he led the way again, looking anxiously over his shoulder at the way the desert man had gone, and eventually grateful to be leaving himself. She shaded her eyes with her hand a moment, which only served to throw the heat of the headache into the greater relief. She looked up at the men at the veranda and saw them moving uncertainly, as if they were waking up, still half under the influence of unpleasant dreams. She felt the same way. Her shoulder creaked when she dropped her arm again. At least it was still a little cooler inside, she thought, and made her way up the steps. Cassie and Beth, their mounts, led away after Harry's followed her. Luncheon was a quiet meal. All those who had played a part in the morning's performance were there. Rather, Harry thought, if we can't quite bring ourselves to separate yet, not because we have any particular reason to cling to one another's company, as if we've just been through something together and are afraid of the dark. Her headache began to subside with the second glass of lemonade, and she thought suddenly, I don't even remember what the man looks like. I looked straight at him the entire time, and I can't remember, except the height of him, and the scarlet sash, and those yellow eyes. The yellow eyes reminded her of her headache, and she focused her thoughts on the food on her plate, and her gaze at the glacial paleness of the lemonade picture. It was after the meal had been cleared away, and still no one made a move to go, that Jack Dedham cleared his throat in a business-like manner and said, We didn't know what to expect, but by the way we're all sitting here avoiding one another's eyes. Harry raised hers, and Jack smiled at her briefly. We don't have any idea what to do with what we've got. Sir Charles, still without looking up, said as if speaking his thoughts aloud, said, What was it, Jack, that you said to him at the end? Harry still had her eyes on Dedham, and while his voice, as he answered, carried just the right inflection, his face did not match it. It's an old catchphrase of sorts, on the let us be friends and not part in anger even though we feel like it, or something. It dates from the days of the Civil War, I think, before we arrived anyway. It's in the old tongue, said Sir Charles. I didn't realize you knew it. Again, Dedham's eyes suggested something other than what he said. I don't. As I said, it's a catchphrase. A lot of ritual greetings are in the old tongue, although almost nobody knows what they mean anymore. Peterson said, Good for you, Jack. My brain wasn't functioning at all after the morning we'd spent. Perhaps you just deflected him from writing off the Outlanders altogether. Harry watched and saw the same thing in Peterson's face that she had and wondered at in Dedham's. Sir Charles shrugged, and the tension was broken. I hope so. I will clutch at any straw. He paused. It did not go well at all. The slow headshakes Dedham and Peterson gave his comments, and much louder than the words could. How great an understatement that was. He won't be back, continued Sir Charles. There was a grim silence of agreement, and then Peterson added, But I don't think he's going to run to the Northerners to make an alliance either. Sir Charles looked up at last. You think not? Peterson shook his head, a quick, decided jerk. No, he would not have listened to Jack at the end then if he had meant to go to our enemies. Jack said, and with what Harry recognized as well-controlled impatience, the hill folk would never ally with the Northerners. They consider them inimical by blood, by heritage, by everything they believe in. They would be declaring themselves not of the hills if they went to the north. Sir Charles ran his hand through his white hair side and said, You know these people better than I, and I will take your word for it, since I can do nothing else. He paused. I will have to write a report of this meeting, of course, and I do not at all know what I will say. Beth and Cassie and Harry were all biting their tongues to keep from asking any questions that might call attention to their interested presence and cause the conversation to be adjourned till the men retired to some official inner sanctum where the fascinating subject could be pursued in private. Therefore, they were both delighted and alarmed when Lady Amelia asked, But Charles, what happened? Sir Charles seemed to focus his gaze with some difficulty on the apprehensive face of his wife. Then his eyes moved over the table, and the girls knew that they had been noticed again. They held their breaths. Said Sir Charles, and there was silence while the tip of Beth's ears turned pink with not breathing. It hurts nothing but our pride to tell you, Dedham said at last. He was here less than 2 hours, rode out of nowhere as far as we could tell. We thought we were keeping watch so we'd have some warning of the arrival. The girls' eyes were riveted on Dedham's face, or they might have exchanged glances. He strode up to the front door as if he were walking through his own courtyard. Fortunately, we had seen them when they entered the gates in the front, and were more or less collected to greet him. Your man, Charles, had the sense to throw open the door before we found out whether or not he could have walked through it. I suppose the first calamity was that we understood each other's languages so poorly. Corlett spoke no Homelander at all, though, frankly, I don't guarantee that means he couldn't. Peterson grunted. You noticed it too, huh? One of the men he had with him did the translating, such as it was, and Peterson and I tried to talk Darien. We did talk Darien, Peterson put in. I know Darien almost as well as I know Homelander, as do you, Jack. You're just more modest about it, and I've managed to make myself understood to Darians from all sorts of corners of the oversized administration, including a few free hill folk. Harry thought, and the Hill King stopped dead as angrily as he was when Dedham addressed him in the old tongue. In all events, Dedham went on, we didn't seem able to make ourselves understood too readily to Corlett, and his translator translated no faster than he had to, I thought, Peterson put in. Denham smiled a little. Ah, your pride's been bent out of shape. Be fair. Peterson answered his smile, but said obstinately, I'm sure of it. You may be right. Denham paused. I wouldn't be surprised. It gave them a little time to look at us a little without seeming to. A little, Sir Charles broke out. Man, they were here less than 2 hours. How can he conclude anything about us in so little a time? He gave us no chance. The tension returned. Denham said cautiously, I dare say he thought he was giving us a chance. I'm not so happy with any man so hasty, said Sir Charles sadly, and the pompous ridiculousness of his words were believed by his tired and worried face. His wife touched his hand where she sat at his right and turned to her and smiled. He looked around the table. Both Peterson and Denham avoided his gaze. He said lightly, almost gaily, it's simple enough. He wants arms, men, companies, regiments, help to close the mountain passes. He, it would appear, does not like the idea of the northerners pouring through his country. Which is reasonable, said Denham carefully. His country could be turned into a battlefield between the northerners and us. There aren't enough hill folk to engage the northerners for any length of time. His country would be overrun, perhaps destroyed in the process, or at least annexed by the victor, he said under his breath. We couldn't possibly do as he asked, Sir Charles said, lapsing back to speaking his thoughts aloud. We aren't even sure that what the northerners mean toward us at present. Peterson said shortly, the hill folks' attitude toward the north being what it is, I am certain that Corlent's spy system is a good one. We offered cooperation, Sir Charles said. Capitulation, you mean, Peterson replied in his blunt way. Sir Charles frowned, if he would agree to put himself and his people entirely under our administration. Now, Bob, Denham said. That's what it amounts to, Peterson said. He should give up his country's freedom that they've hung on to, despite us all these years. It is not unusual that a smaller company should put itself under the protection of a larger when the situation demands it, Sir Charles said stiffly. Before Peterson had a chance to reply, Denham put in hastily, what it comes down to is that he is too proud to hear our terms, and we cannot risk giving London his troops on his terms. The Queen and Council would be most displeased with us if we precipitated an unnecessarily war, said Sir Charles in his best commissioner's voice, and Peterson grunted. We know nothing about the man, Sir Charles continued plaintively. We know that he wants to keep northerners out of Daria, Peterson muttered, but Denham moved in his chair in a gesture Harry correctly translated as bestowing a swift kick at Peterson's ankle, and Peterson subsided. And he would not stay to parley, Denham finished, and here we are, feeling as if we have all been hit in the head. Corlent paced up and down the length of his tent as the riders gathered. He paused at one end of the tent and stared at the close-woven horsehair. The wall moved, for the desert wind was never still. There were so few of the hill folk left, in spite of the small hidden tribes had come out of their fastness to help pledge to Damar's black and white banner after generations of isolation. Corlentha worked hard to reunite the free that remained. But for what, when one thought of the thousands of northerners and eventually the thousands of outlanders who would meet them? For the outlanders would learn soon enough about the northerners' plan for southern conquest. Between them, they would tear his country to shreds. His people would fight, he knew with a sad sore pride, that they would hold on till the last of them was killed, and if it came to that, at best they would be able to continue to live in the hills, in small secret pockets of their hills, hiding in caves and gathering food in the darkness, slipping away like mice in the shadows, avoiding those who held their land, claimed it, and ruled it. The old Damar, before the Civil Wars, before the Outlanders, was only a wistful legend to his people now. Now, much less it would be when there was only a few handfuls of the hill folk living like beggars or robbers in their own hills. But he could not submit them to the Outlanders. Practical benevolence, he called it after a moment's struggle with himself, for his army to be commanded by Outlander generals. The corners of his mouth turned up. There was some bitter humor in the idea of a pragmatic Outlanders caught in a storm of Kilar from both their allies and their opponents. He sighed. Even if by some miracle the Outlanders had agreed to help him, they would have refused to accept the Kilar protection necessary. They didn't even believe Kilar existed. It was a pity there was no non-fatal way to prove it to them otherwise. He thought of the man who had spoken to him, the gray-haired man. There had almost been a belief in him, belief in the ways of the hills that Corlent had read in his face. They might have been able to speak together. That man spoke the hill tongue, understandably at least, although he may not have known quite what he was offering in his few words of the old tongue. Poor Forley, the only one of his riders who knew even as much of the Outlander tongue as Corlentz did, was an unwelcome envoy in a state far more powerful than his own. He had felt the need of even the few minutes a translator might buy him to watch the faces of those he wished to convince. Why wasn't there some other way? For a moment the heavy cloth before him took on a tint of gold. The gold frame might have been a face, and the pale eyes looked at him. She's nothing to do with this. He turned away abruptly and found his riders all seated, watching him, waiting. You already know it is no good. They bowed their head once in acknowledgment, but there was no surprise on their faces. There was never much chance. He broke off as one of the audience dropped his head a little farther than the seriousness of the occasion demanded, and added, "Very well, Farron, there wasn't any chance." Farron looked up and saw the dawn of a smile on his king's face, the nearest thing to the dawn of a smile anyone had seen on his king's face for days past. "No chance," Corlentz repeated, "but I felt obligated to try." He looked up at the ceiling for a minute. "At least it's all over now. Now that any chance of outside assistance has been eliminated, it is time to turn to how best to guard our mountains alone." The Northerners had tried to break through the mountains before, but they had been greedy and fond of war. But while they were cunning, they were also treacherous, and trusted nobody, because they knew that they themselves were not to be trusted. For many years this has been a safeguard to the hill folk, because the Northerners could not band together long enough or in great enough numbers to be a major threat to their neighbors. But in the last quarter century a strong man had arisen from the ranks of the petty generals, a strong man with a little non-human blood in him, which granted him a ruthlessness beyond even the calm and grain of northern malice. And from whatever source he drew his power, he was also a great magician, with skills enough to bring all the bands that prowled the northlands, human and non-human alike, under his command. His name was Thura. Corlentz knew dispassionately that Thura's empire would not last. His son or his son's son would fail, and the Northerners would break up and return to their smaller, nastier, internecine quarrels. Corlentz's father and then Corlentz had watched Thura's rise to their spies, and Corlentz knew or could guess something of the cost of the power he chose to wield, and so knew that Thura would not himself live much longer than an ordinary man. Since the Hill Kings lived long, it might be within Corlentz's own lifetime, even if the Northerners won the coming war, he would be able to lead his people to a successful rebellion. But by then there might not be enough of the country left to rebel or to live off of after the rebellion was finished. Not much more than 500 years ago in Aaron's day, the desert his tent was pitched on had once been meadow and forest. The last level arable land his people had left to them was the plain before the great gap in the mountains where the northern army would come. Sir Charles might beg off now, while the Northerners had not yet attacked any outlander lands, but once they had cut through the hill folk, they would certainly try to seize what more than they could. The entire Darien continent might fall to the mad, eager hands of Thura and the mob, many of them less human than he, and the outlanders would know more than they wished of wizardry. And if the outlanders won, Corlentz did not know how many troops the outlanders had thrown into the battle. Once the battle was engaged, they would learn terribly of Kilar at Thera's hands. But even Kilar was limited at last, and the outlanders were stubborn, and in their stubbornness courageous. Often they were stupid, often ineffectual, and they believed nothing they could not see with their eyes. But they did try hard by their lights, and they were often kind. If the outlanders won, they would send doctors and farmers and seeds and plows and bricklayers. Within a generation his people would be as faithless as the rest of the outlander Darians. And the outlanders were very able administrators by sheer brute persistence. What they had once got their hands on they held. There would be no rebellion that Corlentz could ever see. It was not pleasant to hope for northern victory. His riders knew most of this, even if they did not see it with the dire clarity Corlentz was forced to, and it provided a background to Corlentz's orders now. King's riders were not given to arguing with their king, but Corlentz was an informal man, except occasionally when he was in the grip of his gift, and didn't listen very well to anything else, and usually encouraged conversation. But this afternoon the riders were a silent group, and Corlentz, when he came to the end of what he had to say, simply stopped speaking. Corlentz's surprise was no less than that of his men when he heard himself say, "One last thing. I'm going back to the outlander town. The girl with the yellow hair, she comes with us." End of chapter 3.